Hello, I'm Chris Fowler for Sports Century. He was small for his 15 years, but he had a body quick and strong and a warrior's heart. So it was no surprise when the high school sophomore won the state wrestling championship in the 95-pound division. Then, unspeakable tragedies slammed into his life: the sexual attack and murder of his older sister. She would never leave his memory, he vowed. Thus fueled by the darkest of days, Dan Gable forged what already had been hunger into a ferocity of mind and spirit. He became the most dominant athlete and coach of his sport, perhaps of any sport.
It's the most primitive of all things that people do. It's the first thing that kids do. You know, they start wrestling around with each other.
The whole idea in the sport is for one man to dominate the other man. He's trying to submit you to his physical power.
Wrestling is the most debilitating physical sport I think there is.
I would come out of football season and think I was in pretty good shape. And for about the first 2 weeks of wrestling season, I'd throw up every single day because it was so grueling.
It's painful. It's not very glorious. It's just a great sense of accomplishment.
The way you address wrestling and the way you handle the pressure, success, the failure is going to mold you as an individual.
The athlete who decides that he wants to excel will tax himself to an extreme level. He becomes a fanatic.
Although extremely popular during its heyday in ancient Greece and Rome, amateur wrestling had fallen into obscurity. Then, in the 1960s, the sport received a lift from a young man who seemed invincible.
This is ABC's Wide World of Sports. Takedown for Gable, 2-0 lead.
I always felt that what Dan Gable did in wrestling was the equivalent of Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile, where nobody said it could ever be done. It was impossible.
Here's a kid who hadn't lost for 4 or 5 years. Hadn't lost in scholastic style wrestling. And now he's pinning people, which is like the knockout or the home run. Because that's the finality of it. It's over.
Sometime during his junior year, I believe he became a feared wrestler because you begin to see wrestlers going up a weight class, going down a weight class, to just flat avoid him.
No wrestler in the long and brilliant history of the sport at Iowa State has ever captured the imagination the way this young man has.
Dan Gable enjoyed a junior year at Iowa State that was virtually perfect. Undefeated, he registered 26 pins in 30 matches, including 5 straight at the NCAA tournament. His total world had shrunk to the 12-by-12 dimensions of a wrestling mat.
I can visualize him walking back and forth with his head down. His eyes would get glassy, and you really couldn't even talk to him. In fact, you wouldn't even try because he wouldn't answer you.
Not very many people have the ability to push themselves beyond when they start to hurt. To the point where I've seen him actually crying, being carried out of the restroom.
I saw many times that he'd get somebody he knew he could pin right away, but he wouldn't do it. I really believe that he avoided pinning him so that he could just keep going and make the match last longer.
He was wrestling a wrestler from Colorado by the name of Conrad Metcalf, and he came into the match in Iowa State at Ames at the old Armory, I think 16-0. And I remember a journalist had asked Metcalf, is there any way Gable can pin you? And he says, he may beat me, but there's no way Dan Gable can pin me. Dan was ahead like 10 or 11 to 1 or 2, and Dan just forced him to his back and pinned him. And I remember the Colorado team walked out onto the mat to help Metcalf get off the mat, and Gable was just sitting there. And I remember the coach and the athletes were staring at Gable like, who are you? Where'd you come from?
All of a sudden, he's the closest thing to a superstar there's ever been in wrestling. He wasn't a great interview or anything. You just had this great single-mindedness that people admired.
He was able to concentrate on one area. Wrestling was all he cared about.
He literally ran the class every day
and he always had ankle weights on his ankles, and he always had a rope in his hand, and he'd sit in class and he'd do isometrics during class. And he didn't just do that once. I mean, that's the way he was.
I went to a movie with him once or twice, and he'd usually leave because he wanted to go work out. You're sitting there engrossed in the movie, and all of a sudden Dan will hit you and say, I gotta go.
There was a point in his life where I would have, if somebody were to ask me about Dan, I'd say he's socially retarded. He didn't have a social life.
He was so shy, he wouldn't talk to any girls, and we would always get him on campus, and we would run up and start telling everybody, you know, this is Dan Gable. You guys know he's the most famous wrestler, and he would literally run away and hide.
Finally, in my senior year in college, I actually took a gal out, and I looked at my clock when I got home. It was like 3 a.m., and I had a running practice lined up at 7, and I didn't feel good at that running practice. I was tired all day. That just solidified my mind that it wasn't going to work, and something had to give.
What Gable understood about wrestling is that it's the cruelest mistress in the world. It required all your attention, all your time, all your focus.
Sometimes people who are focused, people say, gee, that person ought to get a life. But his life and his dedication was wrestling.
I don't think Dan Gable physically should have ever accomplished what he did. He made himself into probably the greatest wrestler this country has ever had.
Gable rose to wrestling preeminence by means of a commitment forged in the fires of tragedy.
With the new Geico glove box.
Waterloo, Iowa is not for the faint of heart. Dominated by a factory that makes the John Deere tractor, the blue-collar town stands in bold contrast to the rolling farmland its product serves. Tough, industrial, at times confrontational, it spawned a champion, Dan Gable.
A lot of the athletes were from tough families and backgrounds. It's different than what people think of when they think of Iowa. It's more like a city.
Critics of Waterloo would say it's a Joe Sixpack town.
There was a lot of drinking families, and I would say it developed, for the most part, hardcore, hard-living people.
Born in October of 1948, Dan Gable was the younger of two children of Mac, who sold real estate, and Katie, who reared her children by a severe code of behavior.
Katie probably was the hard one of the bunch, and if we weren't doing things that she thought was right, she'd call us molly puts, wimps.
When I actually lost a match, I was not responding well, and my mom basically read me the riot act, told me to put my ballet slippers on.
He loved his folks. The fact remains that it was a household where abuse happened. Police were called to the house once because Mac was hitting kids. Mac drank too much. Mac drank a lot.
I don't think our family would have had any difficulties if it wasn't carried away with drinking. If my parents were out, if they were not home when they were supposed to be, I was always be at the front room window, waiting for him to come home, thinking maybe something happened to him.
We were over there shooting pool one time, and Mac came home and he had been drinking. And there was a kid named Mike Graham there, and Dan introduced him, and Mike put his hand out, and Mac did an arm drag on him, took him right down on the floor. Well, embarrassed the heck out of Dan.
To escape his dysfunctional home life, Gable often withdrew into daydreams.
He had an older sister who had her own life, basically, and he learned, as kind of an only child would, I think, to make up games for himself.
Well, I would do shadow boxing, shadow wrestling, shadow swimming, shadow baseball playing, just by myself for hours. I'd never lose any of those things. Never lost once.
He would listen to these games, and they'd give him a mental playground that would serve him well as a kid, and that would help him to realize things beyond Easley Street in Waterloo, Iowa.
I was kind of mischievous, and I think I could have been the bad guy. I'm in the back seat of a car, and I'm eating an ice cream cone, and my dad says something that made me mad, so he was wearing the ice cream cone after that. When I was a little kid, I'd walk in his room, and I'd want to destroy this place.
As a teenager, Gable found his lifelong passion in the sport favored by his father. He so loved its Spartan demands that he asked the wrestling coach for the key to the Waterloo West High School training room.
He was so intense about wanting to get going, and I couldn't say no.
Coach Siddons would tell us, if you're walking down the hall and see another wrestler, he said, you can fake like you're making a move. And Danny would try that. He'd always be like he was trying to make a move with somebody.
We were watching West High School in the first round of the 1964 state basketball tournament, and we were sitting in his living room, and he was over grunting and groaning, doing push-ups. Someone says, Gable, what in the hell are you doing? He said, I got to get ready for next year.
Gable's dedication paid an early dividend. As a sophomore, he was undefeated on the mat, taking the 95-pound state title in March of 1964. Then, just 2 months later, the Gables' pride in their son's success was buried under the crushing weight of the darkest of human events. On Memorial Day weekend, 1964, Dan Gable and his parents left for a fishing trip at Harper's Ferry on the Mississippi River. When Mac called the office Monday morning to speak to his 19-year-old daughter Diane, her whereabouts were unknown. There was immediate concern. A call was made to the Gable home.
Nobody answered the phone, so my mom suggested calling the neighbor. So my dad asked if he would go over there and knock on the door and see if what was going on, because she didn't answer the phone. So he called back and said that nobody answered the door. So I'm in the back seat, and I could see a little bit of worry going on. And my dad said, get in that house one way or the other. Why don't you get inside and call us back? And that phone rang, and it's like, everybody kind of like jolted a little bit. My dad picked up the phone, and I could see that he's trying to talk, and he's not saying a whole lot. And my mom's going crazy, and she goes, tell me, something wrong, something wrong. My dad finally shook his head, and he said that she had been hurt. And my mom, she's starting to get hysterical a little bit, but she says, well, what do you mean? How bad? How is she? And all of a sudden my dad chokes out the words, she's not alive.
Diane had been sexually abused and stabbed to death.
Imagine the conversation going on in the front seat. I wasn't saying much, but all of a sudden I did think of something. And I said something to my dad like, I might know something about this. And that did not hit well with him. I mean, he just pulled the car over immediately, and he opened the car door and pulled me out of the car, and he had me up against the car, and he's, what do you mean you might know something about this? And I said, one of the neighbor boys said some things about Diane that, weren't real positive.
Dan told his father that a former schoolmate who had recently dropped out had expressed sexual intentions toward his sister. That information led to the arrest and confession of 16-year-old Tom Kyle, who had been institutionalized for 2 months in 1960 for emotional instability.
There were many people in and out of that home that evening, and it ended up with just her and young Kyle. The police went out immediately and started finding everybody who had been at the Gable house that night. Tom Kyle confessed or blurted out that he had done this.
It was a situation that took that town by the throat and didn't let go for a while.
As kids being around there, you didn't really care to talk with them about it. It was kind of uncomfortable being around them after that for a period of time because you felt so bad for him.
After Kyle got a life sentence, which he now serves in Kansas, the Gables were pulled into an emotional abyss, alternating between sadness and rage. Dan's father stood at the deepest level.
People would commiserate with Mac about his just terrible fortune and, trying to make him feel better. He always thought he was going to cry.
When Mac maybe would have a few drinks and all, he would want to kill this guy.
Police were concerned that Mac would try to do something. The fact that just a year before President Kennedy was assassinated and then Jack Ruby shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, that was brought up. It was fresh in the minds of law enforcement.
There was a fire station right across from the jail. My dad used to go over with binoculars and look in there to see if he could see the kid. And they would let him take a rifle and let him point the rifle at the guy and pull the trigger. And but it wasn't loaded. They were just giving that sense of satisfaction of killing this guy that killed his daughter.
In the months after Diane's violent death, the Gables considered moving to another house. But Dan knew their pain could not be excised geographically.
I just put myself in her frame of mind, my sister's. And I knew that she wouldn't want our lives to change a lot from a standpoint of what was good about it. I told him that I think we ought to stay there at that house. I'd like to move into her room. I think that's where I belong.
That's an amazing and sad thing for a kid to have to go through at that age. To feel responsible for your folks staying together, and thought that if he wrestled well, it would be a unifying force in the family.
This gave him the need to do the very best that he could. I asked him one time, what makes you drive for hard? He said, Harry, I have to win.
With but one defense against the recurrent memory of his sister's death, Gable rededicated himself to wrestling, winning his second and third state championships in 1965 and 66. After compiling a high school career record of 64-0, Gable felt a strong pull from his parents when he considered colleges.
I recruited Dan pretty heavy to come to Oklahoma State. Mac, I know he was devastated, and he said, you know, he's what I've got left, and I really don't want him going away from home.
Gable enrolled at Iowa State, located just over 100 miles from Waterloo.
There were ways in which Dan was definitely the glue. And his mom and dad looked to him as even maybe some hope that there was still a reason for living.
Gable was going to go out there. He was going to beat his opponent. He was going to shake hands. He was going to walk off the mat. The time for celebrating came from the time he walked from the center of the mat to the edge. Then it was on to the next one.
Humble off the mat as he was combative on it, Dan Gable extended his perfect streak, winning NCAA championships in 1968 and 69. Continuing his march through his senior year, Gable took a 181-0 record into his match with Washington sophomore Larry Owens in the NCAA Finals.
Iowa State had just honored him 2 weeks earlier with this big awards ceremony and blanket.
There's a place underneath the eye where we'd like to place the undefeated national champion at the end of the year. We have made room to add outstanding wrestler at the NCAA tournament.
None of those opponents had a chance against Gable. Larry Owens didn't belong on a mat with Dan Gable. Everybody knew that.
Well, Ken Kraft, the big one coming up here, Dan Gable, Larry Owens. What do you think?
Well, what else can we say about Gable? He's just amazing.
We had not sold out NCAA wrestling finals in those years, but this was a hot ticket in town.
Dan, I guess you got a pretty big match tonight against this Owens boy from Washington. Do you have any predictions?
I did have some interviews also. Wild World Sports was interviewing me and asking me why I wanted to wrestle Dan Gable, and of course I looked him right straight in the eye and said, you know, I'm going to beat him.
You know, he's been saying a lot of things about me, so I really got to go. Here he's been predicting that he thinks he can beat you.
I walk into the tournament, and there's a big newspaper. All of a sudden, out of the blue, one of the guys goes, "Hey, look at this, Gable." I go, "What?" "Headlines here that this guy's going to beat you here." I go, "Who?"
Larry Owens used a fabulous psychological technique that Muhammad Ali used on Sonny Liston, and that is to be so overbearing in what you say that pretty soon your competitor can't take you seriously, and then he doesn't know what kind of a person you are.
Hey, Martin, a teammate comes to me, he says, "Coach," he said, you got to come and talk to Dan. He said, he's completely psyched out.
My oldest brother Phil, who had never seen Gable before, he made comment, well, is this guy really that good? And I said, well, you'll get to see tonight.
Well, here we go. There's the champion, Dan Gable, hasn't lost in high school or college.
The bouts before, which were very good bouts and great wrestlers, it was sort of like a prelim. They came to see Dan Gable win again.
There Owens goes again on an underarm spin and a roll through. Beautiful move.
Owens, from the get-go, went after Gable. Usually, most of the athletes that got on the mat with Gable were very cautious.
Moves right back in, bud. On a takedown. He hasn't got it yet. There he does. And now Owens goes out ahead by a score of 6-2. And Dan Gable's in serious trouble here in the second period.
I mean, there were teammates in the stands who were watching the match who weren't even paying attention to it. We're laughing with each other. A couple of them didn't start paying attention until the third period. And they said, you looked at the scoreboard and said, this is close.
Gable looks a bit tired. Yes, he does. Oh, he got it on the way. He's got him down. The 2-point takedown. And on his back also.
As I saw the action, I thought, hey, he got the takedown, but it's 11-11. We're going to see an overtime, which I loved. But there was the 2-point near-fall predicament, I believe we called it at that time.
And Dan Gable is bewildered by the score. He thought that the score would be 11-9 on the board, but a 11-11 tie with his riding time.
There was confusion that in Dan's face, questioning that the near fall was called awful quick. But then I think it was almost like, I can't believe I'm in this position. I've not been here before.
Now there's only 3 seconds remaining. Owens is leading. 13-9 with the riding time. The final score, there it is. 13-11. First time in high school or his collegiate career. Dan Gable, after 181 in a row, has lost.
You could see the look of almost disbelief or amazement on Dan Gable's face, that the reality of it all came to him at that moment.
When we got up on the announcer's stand, they got to Dan Gable, second place, something that he'd never received before. He received his award, and he kind of hung his head, and of course everybody got on their feet and started cheering and everything, and wouldn't stop.
When he took his place on the stand, his head was down. This is what happened with him. Just gradually, the head went up, and with tears. And it's almost tears to tell about it.
Coaches cried. Some of his teammates cried. There was a lump as big as a baseball in my throat because it was one of the most emotional things that I've ever seen.
We had won a team national championship that night. We didn't go out and eat together. There wasn't any celebration because we'd never seen him lose. We were living together off campus. First thing he did was pick up the newspaper. And the headlines of the newspaper, it said, Cyclones win, Gable fails. And he just burst out crying.
His loss showed me he was human. I remember that morning of him drinking beer with a couple of guys. I never saw him do it before, but that day he made the statement, I can't win when I don't drink. What difference does it make?
His mother got the message that he was acting that way, and she says, you just wait a minute, I'll be right down. And she jumped in her car and drove 100 miles, walked in the door, and walked up and slapped him right in the face and said, grow up.
He was supposed to do a banquet maybe a week after that. And at first he goes, I can't do that banquet. I can't do it. I said, you got to put it behind you and move on down the road.
Wasn't easy to take this defeat, but I got to live with it. It's life.
I did feel sorry for Dan Gable. Why couldn't it have happened, someplace that wasn't so important? But to lose, the last match of your career, the capping of a perfect career, that is something that's got to be a crushing blow to anyone.
After the emotional fallout from his first defeat, a regenerated Dan Gable attacked world competitions with ferocity, winning 4 international titles and beating his nemesis Larry Owens in the Olympic trials. Arriving at the Munich Summer Games in 1972, Gable had gained a level of fame unknown to his family and friends.
I was in Russia, and I'm in the semifinals of a huge Russian tournament. The guy went out of bounds. It was a tough match, and when I looked to face him, all I saw was his back. He was walking out of the gymnasium, out of the arena. He had thrown the towel in. The crowd, they went crazy. And they weren't booing their guy. They went crazy for me.
Embraced by Russian fans, Gable confounded Soviet leadership at the 1972 Olympics.
The Soviet Union had a machine. They won every Olympic and every world competition during that entire period of time. But they were miffed by the inability to put a person on the wrestling mat that could beat Dan Gable.
They tried to disqualify him when he cut his eye in the first period. First period, first match. The Russian doctor came over with the idea of disqualifying Gable, and we wouldn't let him into the corner. But they would love to have disqualified him because they couldn't beat him.
He was drug tested 3 times. The Russians said, you must drug test this athlete. There's nobody that can compete at this high a level unless he's on something.
Solly, it appears, Ken is just trying to survive this. Yeah, he hopes to get through the match.
All of a sudden, you see this metamorphosis take place over his opponent.
There's the fall, Frank. It's all over. Dan Gable has pinned Safer Solly of Yugoslavia.
They were not just down and pinned, they were whipped. And they were exhausted. And he would stand up, and he wasn't even breathing hard.
Gable's superiority over his Olympic competition was so great that he never lost a point while winning 6 straight matches.
Dan Gable has won the gold medal at 149.5 pounds, defeating Ruslan Ashuruliev of Russia 3-0. And in my book, maybe the most dedicated athlete I've ever known.
He's walking off the mat, and we pick him up and start carrying him. And as we do, Dan is sitting up on our shoulders saying, "What are you doing? Put me down, put me down." And he just continues to say, "Okay, I came here to win, and I did. So put me down."
During the national anthem, several things flashed before my eyes and my mind. And one of them was my sister, a big picture of my sister. And it was just like a gratifying type of situation with me and her at that particular time.
Five days after Gable's victory, terror held the Olympics and the world in its grip.
The peace of what have been called the Serene Olympics was shattered just before dawn this morning, about 5 o'clock, when Arab terrorists armed with submachine guns climbed the fence and immediately killed one man. They've now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
It was the first charter that landed in America, and somebody was in New York waiting with a microphone.
What's it like in Munich today?
The weather is about the same. It was a pretty nice day.
Look at the mood. I mean the mood, the atmosphere.
And they go, "Oh, no, no, no. It was a terrorist." I felt like an idiot. I'm still on this other focus, and you got to get me on your wavelength before I can tell you what you're supposed to know.
Even some of the athletes that are not balanced, society then comes to them because of their greatness. And I think in Dan's case, the higher he went up and the more narrow his focus was, the better he got, the more society came to him.
The Dick Cavett Show. Tonight, Dick's guests are gold medal winner in wrestling, Dan Gable.
From an underhook tie-up position, right here. I'm controlling here. Ankle pick. Circle me in a circle. Yeah, yeah. Step in here. Pick you. Oh, nice.
Did I hurt you?
No.
He represents our sport to the average person in our society. For the most part, they don't even like wrestling. There'll be a lot of people that say, well, it's a sport, it's funny, but they can't walk away from a story about Dan Gable and not be impressed with what kind of a dedicated athlete he was.
Shortly before his gold medal performance at the Munich Olympics, Gable was laying the foundation for his future as an assistant coach. But his choice of schools was a shocker. Iowa State's arch rival, the University of Iowa.
The problem that we had, our athletic director was sort of dragging his feet. And finally he decided, okay, we'll call him and hire him. The only problem was that 24 hours earlier, Iowa had taken him.
He wanted to stay at Iowa State. He was just hoping that they would work out some way that he could stay. Dan Gable never wanted to be a Hawkeye.
4 years after his controversial move to Iowa, Gable became the Hawkeyes' head coach. It was clear the coals of competition never burned brighter.
He was as into it as if he was still training to go to the Olympics, as if he'd never won an NCAA championship. His wrestlers had to sort of work twice as hard just to keep up with him, and he wasn't even competing anymore.
Lou Bannock, when he was national NCAA champion heavyweight, I said, what's the toughest thing you ever went through, Lou? He said, getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and wrestling Gable. He said, Gable could whip me. He said he could whip me, and I was a heavyweight.
Every workout was trying to see how much more tired he can get his athletes. In order to break people, it has to be some degree of physical torture.
If I see you not doing something, I'll put one of you down.
I would rather do time than go back and do some of that stuff.
You would have what he called buddy carries, where there are 80 steps from the floor of Carver Hawkeye Arena to the balcony. You would put someone else your weight on your back and run up those steps with him.
We'd go up to run, and he'd get us all loosened up, and he'd go, all right, just run as fast as you can go, as hard as you can go, sprint. Well, how many laps? I don't know.
A lot of his athletes have done what they've done for one basic reason. They wanted him to respect them so much that they performed at a much higher level than they could have at anywhere else in the country.
If you wrestle for Dan Gable, I think you're afraid not to give it your all.
Go, let's go. You know, he doesn't want to cut a pound. His body won't let him cut a pound. Well, then you better win the tournament, okay?
To disappoint Dan Gable is to disappoint the father of the sport.
Guys grew up wanting to go there just because, you know, he set the standard in the sport. That was a level everybody wanted to achieve. The only way to leave there was to be a national champ.
He had in his mind what was the perfect wrestler that he wanted to recruit. There's a young man from Tulsa, and he's one of the first 4-time state champions from Oklahoma. And Dan Gable didn't offer him a scholarship, and almost every other big wrestling school had. And when asked why, Dan said, well, when I talked to him, he had other interests besides wrestling.
The unsparing, obsessive attitude branded on the minds of his mat warriors resulted in one of the best runs in collegiate sports history. Beginning in 1978, the Hawkeyes won 9 straight national championships.
Every team rule was set to the individual. He knew everybody so well, what made them tick, what was wrong with their girlfriend, you know, did they go out the night before?
They'll work and work and work while other coaches are home with their families or out dining or playing golf or something. Gable's trying to find out about his athletes.
That was his life. You know, we were his life. We were, you know, what he enjoyed.
I remember driving around town, and we'd have to tell him where to get to places, because the only place he knew how to get to was Carver Hawkeye Arena.
I can remember being at press conferences year after year. What keeps you motivated, Dan Gable? And he would say, I want to have 10 national champions. I mean, it wasn't something that was funny or humor. It was just, I want to have 10 national champions. Next question.
Perfection is something that becomes very elusive, because the harder you pursue it, the more you achieve it, the more you want. It's never enough. You become an addict. It's not that you want to win, it's that you have to win. And that is exactly what Gable is all about.
As they strove to extend their string of national championships, the 1987 Hawkeyes wore uniforms bearing the Roman numeral 10.
This intriguing story of Dan Gable and the Iowa Hawkeyes and their attempt to win an unprecedented 10th consecutive national championship.
There was no really reason to believe that we wouldn't win the 10th, and it was like, wow, that's kind of cocky, but so what? We're all a little cocky in that program.
After 9 years on top, Gable's drive toward history was halted in its tracks by his old school.
There's a ball! And there's the team championship for Iowa State.
We took second to a great team And it was like JFK got shot again when we came back here. It was mourning. It was bad.
It's kind of amazing that it happened to me as an athlete, and now it's happened to me as a coach, and I didn't even catch it. I mean, I think I'd be smart enough to realize that one loss that still bothers me today wouldn't have happened in my coaching, but no, it happened.
He wanted to change everything. He thought he was losing grips with the team or something. He thought it was just the end of the world.
While Gable's Samurai were winning matches, medals, and fame in the 1980s, some of their off-mat activities were bringing dishonor to the university.
They were making it on the police blotter, for one thing. And I don't mean routinely, but enough so you really started picking it up. You notice guys who'd been charged with drunk and disorderly. Wrestlers would get into fights at bars with basketball players. I mean, they had no respect for basketball players. I mean, what are these guys? They just run up and down the court, they do wind sprints, and this is a hard practice.
There was one wrestler in particular. There'd be nights where he'd be calling and saying that, he'd need a ride or whatever, and so my dad would go pick him up and bring him here, and he'd spend the night on our couch.
They needed help. They were doing too much partying or whatever, and the newspapers were writing about how, Gable should kick this kid off the team. I just remember Dan saying, well, if I didn't let this kid back on the team, what else would he have? This is the only thing he has in his life.
We'd have internal meetings. So-and-so is going to be out of practice because he was downtown in a fight again. And he kept telling us, he goes, I don't have any control over it anymore. The institution has taken over. I can't come to your rescue anymore.
In the wake of repeated offenses, adverse publicity, and tighter university control, Iowa's wrestling team experienced a 4-year drought. Meanwhile, Gable entered a period of reappraisal.
That was the first time that I saw Gable have some indecision about what to do.
Between 1987 and 1990, Iowa struggled, but Dan Gable's taste for victory never dulled. He began to stoke the coals of greatness, and the Hawkeyes won 5 titles in the next 6 years.
I remember the first time I really saw him on campus when I came here, he said to me, you're going to be the guy that wins 4 national titles for us. That day I started to think, I'm going to be a 4-time national champion.
Lincoln McElravy was key to Iowa's resurgence, winning national championships in his first 2 years. But when the Star faltered in the 1995 NCAA Finals as the #1 seed, the loss cut deep across the grain of Gable's victory-driven heart.
Marionetti is going to upset 2-time champion Lincoln McElravy.
His wrestlers are like his sons. Each loss takes something away from him. He really saw that loss as kind of a reflection of his own loss. I've never seen my dad go through something like that, just because I think it brought back so many memories for him.
After sitting out the next season to try out for the U.S. Olympic team, McElravy returned to Gable's fold in the fall of 1996. Striving for his 15th NCAA championship in 21 seasons as Iowa's head coach, Gable, at 48, began to break down physically.
In December of '96, he tried to get up out of bed in the morning, and all of a sudden he just fell back onto the bed, and just by getting out of bed, it had fractured his hip.
In January of 1997, Gable's left hip was surgically replaced. True to character, he was back with his boys 16 days later.
Time! Figure 8!
At the Big Tens, after he had his hip replaced, we got hosed bad against the Minnesota wrestler. I look over in the stands, and Gable, he gets his crutches, and he comes hobbling up there, and the match is going on, and takes his crutches and just bangs them twice. Referee blows a whistle. Hold on, what's going on? He goes over there, and Gable just chewed his butt.
That March, Gable's men entered the NCAA tournament wearing the tag of underdog, unusual for him. But the arena where the competition would be held was all too familiar. It was 8 miles from where Gable grew up, hungry and tough.
He had a kid named Jesse Whitmer, and the kid had never wrestled in the starting lineup until his senior year. Dan was always believed in him and always was touting him how, he could really be good.
He is a first-time All-American. He is now a first-time national champion.
He's yelling and screaming and yelling, strongest man in the world, Jesse Whitmer, the strongest man in the world.
Lincoln McElravy didn't disappoint either, winning his third individual title. Iowa's 170 team points set a tournament record as the Hawkeyes won the NCAA championship.
Dan was a great visionary, but I don't think he even quite envisioned what they accomplished that year. I remember at one point during the tournament, he came up to me and he just says, "I can't believe this. Can you believe this?"
It was crucial that the national tournament would be in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And for him to end there, it was kind of a closure that I think he was looking for.
On July 14th, 1997, Gable announced his retirement. With 15 national titles as a head coach, he knew he had achieved greatness, if not the impossible dream, born deep in a childhood that could not endure defeat.
Lenny Zaleski, Scott Trezino, Tim Riley, Jeff Kerber, those are young men that never reached the pinnacle, that were this close. And stuff like that eats at me.
It was an astonishing thing to say, to sort of admit how devastating those losses were when you consider how many victories there were alongside them. But I think that psychologically, that's completely consistent with who he is.
Gable has remained close to wrestling as an athletic department assistant for the Hawkeyes and as an analyst for Iowa Public TV.
Oh boy, I tell you, this is quite a scramble. People are having a good time here.
He used to have a saying that the best thing about wrestling is it teaches you how to get off your back, and life puts you on your back all the time.
Dan Gable is bedrock middle America. You're not going to be anything else when you grow up in Waterloo, Iowa. The basics were hard work, perseverance, dedication. Life, according to Dan Gable, is a simple process.
A stranger at Dan Gable's door in Iowa City came with one request. Please, would he wrestle his idol? Obliging beyond reason, Gable relented and deftly deposited his visitor on the basement floor. The man left looking like he'd been blessed. And why not? As author John Irving had written, when Dan Gable lays his hands on you, you are in touch with grace. For Sports Century, I'm Chris Fowler.